When Mason Sinclair pulled back that blood-stained blanket in the New Mexico desert, he expected to find another victim of frontier violence. Instead, he discovered a woman whose whispered confession, "I'm filthy inside and out," would drag him into a web of corruption so deep it reached from Chicago's elite mansions to the lawless territories. What Eleanor Winter had witnessed would make powerful men kill to keep silent, and Mason's dark past as a bounty hunter was about to collide with a conspiracy that traded innocent lives like cattle. Stay with me until the very end of this tale of justice and redemption, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across our vast land. Part 1. The summer of 1893 had been merciless to New Mexico territory, turning the earth to dust and the sky to brass. Mason Sinclair stood on his cabin's weathered porch, watching heat waves dance across the desert floor like ghosts of better times. 3 years had passed since he'd hung up his guns, 3 years since he'd sworn never to take another life, no matter the provocation. The ranch was small, barely profitable, but it was honest work, something his late wife Sarah would have been proud of. The silence stretched endlessly across the mesa until it shattered. Crack, 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 gunshots maybe 2 miles northeast near Devil's Canyon. Mason's hand instinctively moved toward his hip, finding only empty leather. He'd locked his Colts in the strongbox the day he buried Sarah, promising her grave he'd find another way to live. Crack. A final shot echoed off the canyon walls, followed by a silence more ominous than the gunfire itself. Mason stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to investigate. In his bounty hunting days, those patterns meant one thing: execution shots. Someone cleaning up loose ends. "Not my fight," he muttered, trying to convince himself. "Not anymore." But as the minutes crawled by, an image haunted him. Sarah's face, the night she'd pleaded with him to find a different path. "There's always another way, Mason," she'd whispered. "Violence only breeds more violence." She'd been wrong about many things, but she'd been right about the weight of blood on a man's soul. 20 minutes later, Mason was saddling Thunder, his black stallion, trying to ignore the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his dead wife. What if someone needs help? What if you could save a life instead of taking one? The ride to Devil's Canyon took him through familiar territory, land he'd crossed countless times pursuing wanted men. Every rock formation, every twisted mesquite held memories of violence. But today felt different. Today, he wasn't hunting. The smell hit him first: copper and cordite blood and gunpowder baking in the merciless sun. Thunder snorted nervously as they crested the ridge overlooking the canyon floor. Below, in a small clearing beside a dried creek bed, Mason saw them. 3 men lay sprawled in the dust, their bodies twisted in the final poses of violent death. 2 wore expensive suits, wholly unsuited for desert travel, city men probably from back east. The third was local, judging by his clothes, but his boots were too fine for a working cowboy. These weren't casual killings. Someone had been hunting these men specifically. Mason dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the scene with professional detachment. The city men had been shot center mass, quick and efficient. No torture, no unnecessary cruelty. But the local man had been different. He'd been on his knees when the bullet took him execution style. Professional work. Mason murmured, then caught himself. Old habits died hard. That's when he saw the blanket. Tucked behind a large boulder almost hidden from view lay a dirty wool blanket. Something was underneath it, something that rose and fell with shallow, labored breathing. Mason approached carefully, his hand reaching instinctively for guns that weren't there. The blanket was stained with blood and dirt, and whatever lay beneath it was small, fragile. As he knelt and slowly pulled back the rough wool, his breath caught in his throat. A woman stared up at him with eyes the color of winter's sky, but her gaze held depths of suffering that made Mason's chest tighten. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair matted with blood and dust. Her dress had once been fine, good fabric, careful stitching, but now it was torn and stained beyond recognition. Bruises covered her face and arms, some fresh, others yellowing with age. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They held a haunted quality he'd seen only in the faces of men who'd witnessed unspeakable horrors. Whatever this woman had endured, it had scarred her soul as surely as any physical wound. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, Don't let them find me." Mason's throat tightened. "You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you." She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the rocky ground. When she spoke again, her words hit him like a physical blow. I'm filthy inside and out. You don't understand what they made me, what I've seen. The raw pain in her voice made something crack inside Mason's chest. He'd heard confessions from dying men, pleas from the desperate, but nothing had ever cut through him like this woman's broken whisper. Ma'am, whatever happened to you, it's over now. My name's Mason Sinclair. I'm going to get you somewhere safe. She studied his face with those haunting eyes, searching for something truth perhaps, or simply the absence of cruelty. Finally, she nodded slightly. Eleanor, she said. Eleanor Winter. As Mason carefully lifted her into his arms, noting how she weighed almost nothing, Eleanor's eyes fluttered closed, but not before he saw something else there, a flicker of hope so fragile it might shatter at the slightest touch. The ride back to his cabin took an hour with Eleanor drifting in and out of consciousness against his chest. She muttered sometimes fragments of words that made no sense. The children, Judge Montgomery, they're still there, still trapped. By the time they reached his small ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Mason's cabin was simple 3 rooms he'd built with his own hands, but it was clean and defensible. He carried Eleanor inside and laid her on his bed, the same bed where Sarah had died 3 years ago. For a moment the past and present collided. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper from the walls. This is what I meant, Mason. This is the other way. Eleanor's eyes opened as he began examining her injuries. Why are you helping me? She asked. Because it's the right thing to do. Most men wouldn't see it that way. Not after what I've been. Mason paused in his examination. Her injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. Ribs probably cracked, possible concussion, numerous cuts and bruises, but the deepest wounds weren't visible. I don't know what happened to you, Miss Winter, but I know this: what other people did to you doesn't define who you are. Tears gathered in her eyes. You don't understand. I let them. I didn't fight hard enough. Those children... Stop. Mason's voice was gentle but firm. You survived. That took more strength than you know. As he tended her wounds, Eleanor began to talk slowly at first, then in a torrent of words that seemed to pour from some deep well of pain. She'd been a governess in Chicago, she said, working for a wealthy banker named Calhoun. She'd discovered something terrible, something about missing children and powerful men. When she'd tried to expose the truth, they'd taken her. They kept me for weeks, she whispered, staring at the ceiling, moving me from place to place, making me watch what they did to the children, said if I ever talked, they'd do worse than kill me. Mason felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same cold fury that had driven him through 7 years of bounty hunting. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't about justice or revenge, it was about protection. How did you get away? I didn't. They were transporting me here to New Mexico, said they had a buyer. Her voice broke on the word. But something went wrong. The local man, Garrett, they called him, he got greedy, started demanding more money. That's when the shooting started. And you hid. I crawled behind that rock and played dead, waited until they were all gone. She turned to look at him directly. You could have ridden away. Why didn't you? Mason was quiet for a long moment, thinking of Sarah, of the promises he'd made to her grave. Because some things are more important than staying safe. That evening, as Eleanor slept fitfully in his bed, Mason sat on his porch cleaning guns he'd sworn never to touch again. But as he worked, he wasn't thinking about killing. He was thinking about the children Eleanor had mentioned, still trapped somewhere, still suffering. He was thinking about powerful men who believed they could buy and sell human lives without consequence. And he was thinking about the look in Eleanor's eyes, not just the pain, but the strength he'd glimpsed beneath it. She was broken, yes, but not defeated. There was steel in her spine, even if she couldn't feel it yet. Around midnight, Eleanor's screams woke him from an uneasy sleep. He found her thrashing in the bed, caught in the grip of some terrible dream. No, please, not the little girl. She's only 6, please. Mason gently shook her awake. Eleanor, you're safe. It's just a dream. She sat up, gasping, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. It wasn't a dream. It was a memory. Tell me. And she did. Through tears and shaking voice, she told him about the children, dozens of them, some as young as 5, kept in warehouses and basement rooms. Orphans who wouldn't be missed, immigrant children whose families had been told they'd died of disease. All of them destined for buyers who preferred their merchandise, young and helpless. There was this one little girl, Eleanor whispered. Red hair, green eyes. She reminded me of myself at that age. She'd been there so long she'd forgotten her real name. They called her 16. Her voice broke. Because that's what she was to them. A number. Mason felt something fundamental shift inside him. The man who'd tried to leave violence behind was gone, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Where? He asked quietly. I don't know exactly. They blindfolded me whenever they moved me. But I know it's not far. The children, they're still there, Mason, still waiting for someone to save them. The next morning brought a visitor. Mason saw the dust cloud long before the rider appeared. Someone coming fast with purpose. He helped Eleanor to a chair by the window where she could see out while staying hidden, then stepped onto his porch. The man who rode up was everything Mason expected from Eleanor's description, well-dressed but hard-faced with the kind of casual cruelty that marked professional killers. He wore 2 guns and carried himself like a man accustomed to getting his way through fear. Morning, the stranger said, not dismounting. Name's Garrett. I'm looking for something that went missing yesterday. A woman. Young dark hair, probably hurt pretty bad. Mason kept his expression neutral. Haven't seen anyone like that. Garrett's smile was cold as winter wind. Funny thing about yesterday's shooting, we found tracks leading away from the scene, horse tracks leading this direction. A lot of horses travel this road. Sure. But not many carry double, and not many riders stop to pick up damaged goods in the middle of nowhere. Garrett leaned forward in his saddle. See, this particular piece of property is worth a lot of money to some very important people. They're willing to pay handsomely for its return. And they're equally willing to pay for anyone who might have interfered to disappear permanently. Mason felt the familiar weight of his Colts on his hips. He'd strapped them on that morning, knowing this moment would come. Like I said, I haven't seen anyone. Garrett studied him for a long moment, then his gaze shifted to the cabin windows. Mind if I take a look around, just to satisfy my curiosity? I mind. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Garrett's hand moved closer to his gun. You sure about that, friend? I've got 12 men scattered around this valley. One word from me and this place becomes your tomb. From inside the cabin came a sound that made both men freeze, the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked. The only tomb being dug today won't be his. Eleanor's voice carried clearly through the open window. Mason couldn't see her, but he could hear the steel in her voice. The broken woman from yesterday was gone, replaced by someone who'd found her backbone again. Garrett's face darkened. There she is. Come on out, little dove. Time to go home. I am home, Eleanor replied. And if you're not off this property in the next 10 seconds, I'm going to put a bullet through your black heart. You don't have the spine for killing. A rifle shot rang out, kicking up dust 3 inches from Garrett's horse's front hoof. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider. 9 seconds, Eleanor called out. Garrett fought to control his mount, his face twisting with rage. This isn't over. Judge Montgomery has long arms and longer memory. You can't hide forever. Maybe not, Mason said quietly, but we don't have to hide from you. Something in his tone must have penetrated Garrett's anger, because the man took a long, careful look at Mason, noting the tied-down holsters, the easy stance, the complete absence of fear. Who are you? Garrett demanded. Just a rancher. But Garrett's eyes had gone wide with sudden recognition. Jesus Christ, you're Mason Sinclair, the Undertaker. Mason said nothing, but he didn't deny it either. Garrett backed his horse away, his bravado evaporating. Even killers like him had heard the stories. Mason Sinclair, the bounty hunter who'd never failed to bring in his target, who'd faced down the Dalton gang single-handed, who'd tracked Blackjack Morrison through 3 territories and brought him back tied to his saddle. This changes things, Garrett said, but his voice had lost its edge. No, Mason replied. It doesn't. You still need to leave. After Garrett rode away, Mason found Eleanor slumped against the window frame, the rifle trembling in her hands. I've never shot at a person before, she whispered. You did good. Stood your ground when it mattered. He'll be back, with more men. Probably. Eleanor looked at him with those winter blue eyes. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Mason was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Sarah, about the children still trapped somewhere in darkness, about the path his life had taken and where it might lead next. My wife used to say that we're all connected like threads in a tapestry. Pull one thread and the whole thing moves. Maybe this is just my thread being pulled. And maybe you're just a good man trying to do right. I haven't been a good man for a long time, Eleanor. But maybe that can change. That afternoon, while Eleanor rested, Mason rode out to check his boundaries and think. He'd known this moment would come eventually, the day his past caught up with his present, but he'd always imagined it would be someone seeking revenge for old grudges, not someone asking him to be the man Sarah had always believed he could be. When he returned at sunset, he found Eleanor on the porch, wearing one of Sarah's old dresses. It was too big for her, but it was clean and whole, and somehow it made her look less like a victim and more like a survivor. I found something, she said, holding up a piece of paper. It was sewn into the lining of my dress. I'd forgotten about it. The paper was small, torn from what looked like a ledger. In careful handwriting, someone had written, Warehouse District Building 47, Tuesdays and Fridays, Judge Montgomery, Senator Caldwell, the banker knows everything. Thomas. Thomas Garrett's brother, Eleanor explained. He was supposed to be part of their organization, but he had second thoughts. He tried to help me escape the first time. They killed him for it. Mason studied the note. This is evidence. It's more than that. It's a roadmap to finding the children. Eleanor, these are powerful men. They have money, influence, private armies. Going after them would be suicide, she finished. I know, but those children don't have anyone else. And after what I've seen, after what they've done, she met his eyes. I can't live with myself if I don't try. Mason looked at the woman sitting across from him, still pale, still healing, but with a fire in her eyes that reminded him of Sarah. His wife had been wrong about many things, but she'd been right about the most important thing: there was always another way. Sometimes that way led through darkness, but it didn't have to end in darkness. All right, he said quietly. But we do this smart. No rushing in with guns blazing. We gather information, make allies, find out exactly what we're dealing with. Eleanor's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This road we're starting down, there's no guarantee where it leads. I know. But for the first time since this nightmare started, I feel like I'm choosing my own path instead of just surviving someone else's. As stars began to appear in the vast New Mexico sky, Mason and Eleanor sat on the porch making plans. They would start in the town of Redemption, 30 miles south, a place where Mason still had a few contacts from his bounty hunting days. If Judge Montgomery was operating a trafficking ring, someone in Redemption would know about it. There's something else, Eleanor said as they prepared to go inside. Something I haven't told you. Mason waited. I'm not the first governess Calhoun hired. There were others before me, young women who asked too many questions or saw too much. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They didn't just disappear, Mason. They were sold too, older merchandise for different buyers. The weight of that revelation settled over them like a shroud. They weren't just dealing with child trafficking, they were looking at something much larger, much more organized. How many? Mason asked. I don't know, dozens, maybe more. Women who trusted the wrong people, asked the wrong questions, or just had the misfortune to be young and pretty in the wrong place. Mason felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, but this time he welcomed it. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about justice, real justice for the children and women who couldn't fight for themselves. Then we stopped them all, he said simply. Eleanor reached out and took his hand. Together, together. As they stood to go inside, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the ridgeline or the way moonlight glinted off the telescope in his hands. Garrett had indeed returned and he'd brought help, but he wasn't planning another direct confrontation. Men like Judge Montgomery didn't stay in power by being reckless. They planned, they waited, and they struck when their enemies were most vulnerable. The war for Eleanor Winter's soul and the souls of dozens of innocent children was just beginning. And in the distance, like an approaching storm, the sound of many horses could be heard moving through the night. The sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them just as Mason was about to blow out the lantern. He held up a hand motioning Eleanor to silence and moved to the window. Through the darkness, he could make out at least 8 riders spread in a wide arc around his property, too many for a social call, too few for an all-out assault. This was reconnaissance, a show of force designed to intimidate. "They're testing us," he whispered to Eleanor, "seeing how we react." Eleanor had retrieved the rifle again, her hand steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "What do we do?" "We let them know we're not afraid." Mason stepped onto his porch, making himself visible in the lamplight. He wore his guns openly now, no longer pretending to be just a simple rancher. The riders held their positions close enough to be seen, but far enough to avoid easy rifle range. "Evening, boys," Mason called out. "Beautiful night for a ride. Hope you're not planning to stay long. I don't have enough coffee for everyone." A voice came back from the darkness, not Garrett's, but someone older, more authoritative. "Mr. Sinclair, Judge Montgomery sends his regards. He'd like to extend an invitation for you and your house guest to visit Redemption, tomorrow if convenient." "And if it's not convenient?" "The judge is a patient man, but his patience has limits. The woman belongs to him, Mr. Sinclair. This is your opportunity to return his property without unpleasantness." Mason felt Eleanor stiffen beside him at the word property, and he could practically feel the anger radiating from her. "Tell the judge I appreciate his invitation," Mason replied, "but Miss Winter isn't property and she's under my protection now." A long silence stretched between the riders and the cabin. Finally, the voice came again. "The judge hoped you'd see reason. He remembers your reputation, a practical man who understood that some fights aren't worth taking. But perhaps retirement has made you soft. Perhaps. Why don't you ride closer and find out?" Another silence, then the sound of horses moving, but they were retreating, not advancing. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Sinclair. The judge looks forward to your visit." As the hoofbeats faded into the night, Eleanor lowered the rifle. "They'll be back." "Yes, but not tonight. Tonight they want us to sit here and worry, imagine what's coming. Fear is their best weapon." "And what's ours?" Mason looked at her, this woman who'd been broken and beaten, but still found the courage to aim a rifle at armed killers. Truth, and the fact that we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Mason cleaned and loaded every weapon he owned while Eleanor searched through his cabin, taking inventory of supplies. She'd found a map of the territory and was studying the roads between his ranch and Redemption. "There's an old mining trail that cuts through the mountains," she said, tracing a thin line with her finger. "It would add a day to the journey, but we'd avoid the main roads." "We're not running." Eleanor looked up sharply. "I'm not suggesting we run. I'm suggesting we choose our battlefield." Mason paused in his work. There was steel in her voice now, the broken bird transforming into something fiercer. "What are you thinking? You said we need allies in Redemption, but walking straight into town would be suicide. They'll have men watching every road, every hotel, every way in or out." She pointed to a spot on the map where the mining trail emerged near a small settlement. "But if we came in the back way through Cedar Creek, we might be able to move around without being seen." "Cedar Creek's a ghost town. Been empty for 2 years since the silver played out." "Exactly. No one would think to look for us there, and it's close enough to Redemption that we could scout the town, gather information." Mason studied the map more carefully. The plan had merit. Cedar Creek would give them a base of operations while they figured out exactly what they were up against. "It's a hard ride through rough country. You're still healing." "I'm stronger than I look." "I'm beginning to see that." Dawn was breaking when they finally finished their preparations. Mason had packed light ammunition, medical supplies, enough food for several days. Eleanor had bundled what few possessions she had, including the precious note that might be their only real evidence against Montgomery's organization. As they saddled their horses, Thunder for Mason and a gentle mare named Star for Eleanor, Mason found himself thinking about Sarah again. She'd hated his profession, hated the violence and death that followed him. But she'd also understood justice, had spent her own life teaching school children and caring for anyone who needed help. "She would have liked you," he said suddenly. Eleanor looked up from adjusting her stirrups. "Your wife, Sarah, she had your same fire, your same refusal to back down when something mattered. Tell me about her." As they rode away from the ranch, possibly for the last time, Mason found himself talking about Sarah in ways he hadn't since her death. How she'd challenged him to be better than his reputation. How she'd seen past the killer to the man underneath. How she'd died of fever while he was away, chasing a bounty, too proud to give up his profession until it was too late. The last thing she said to me was that there was always another way, he finished. I thought she was wrong, but maybe she just meant I hadn't found it yet. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, her mare picking her way carefully along the narrow mountain trail. Finally, she spoke. In Chicago, before all this started, I used to teach the bankers' children. Little Emma was 8, bright as a penny, always asking questions about everything. She'd point to people on the street and make up stories about their lives. This one was a secret princess, that one was an explorer from Africa. Her voice caught slightly. The day I discovered what her father was really doing, Emma asked me why I looked so sad. I told her sometimes grown-ups make bad choices and other grown-ups have to decide whether to speak up or stay quiet. She said, "But Miss Eleanor, if you stay quiet when bad things happen, doesn't that make you a little bit bad too?" Smart girl. 8 years old, and she understood something I'd forgotten. We don't get to choose whether bad things happen in the world, but we get to choose what we do about them. The trail wound higher into the mountains, leaving the desert heat behind for cooler air that smelled of pine and stone. They rode in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, until Eleanor suddenly pulled up her mare. "Someone's following us." Mason had noticed it too, the occasional glint of metal in the distance, the way birds scattered from trees behind them. One rider staying well back but definitely on their trail. "Just one?" "I think so. Could be a scout, could be someone planning to pick us off when we stop to rest." Mason considered their options. The trail ahead offered several good ambush spots, places where they could turn the tables on their pursuer. "There's a narrow pass about a mile ahead, good cover only one way through. We could wait for him there. Or we could keep going and see what he wants. If it's just one man, he's either very confident or very stupid. In my experience, the confident ones are more dangerous." They chose the ambush. At the narrow pass, Mason positioned Eleanor with the rifle behind a cluster of boulders, while he took cover on the opposite side of the trail. Anyone following would have to ride right between them. 20 minutes later, their patience was rewarded. A single rider appeared at the mouth of the pass, but it wasn't one of Montgomery's men. It was a woman riding a paint horse and wearing men's clothes. She was young, maybe Eleanor's age, with black hair braided down her back and skin that spoke of mixed heritage. "That's not what I expected," Eleanor murmured. The woman seemed to sense the trap because she stopped her horse and called out, "Mason Sinclair, I know you're up there somewhere. My name is Maria Santos. I worked for Dr. Patterson in Redemption until 3 days ago. I need to talk to you about Judge Montgomery and the missing children." Mason and Eleanor exchanged glances. This could be a trap, but something in the woman's voice suggested desperation rather than deception. "Come ahead," Mason called back. "Slow and easy." Maria rode into the pass with her hands visible, no weapons drawn. Up close, Mason could see she was even younger than he'd thought, but her eyes held the same haunted quality he'd seen in Eleanor's. "You're the governess," Maria said, looking at Eleanor. "The one who escaped from Calhoun's organization." "How do you know that?" "Because I helped treat some of the children you saw. Dr. Patterson ran a clinic in Redemption, supposedly treating orphans and immigrants for various ailments, but the medicine he was giving them," Maria's voice broke. "It was designed to make them compliant, easier to handle. I didn't understand at first, thought he was just trying to help traumatized children. But when I started asking questions—" "He had you silenced," Mason finished. "He tried. 2 nights ago, I overheard him talking to Judge Montgomery about increasing the doses about some big shipment coming in from the east. When I tried to leave town, Montgomery's men came after me. I've been hiding in the mountains ever since." Eleanor climbed down from her hiding place, studying Maria's face carefully. "You said you treated some of the children I saw. Do you remember a little girl with red hair? They called her 16. Maria's face crumpled. "Catherine. Her real name was Catherine O'Brien. Her parents died in a factory fire in Chicago. She was so scared when they brought her in, kept asking for her mama." Tears streamed down her face. "She's still there, Miss Winter, still asking for her mama." Eleanor's composure finally broke. She sank to her knees, sobbing for the children she hadn't been able to save, for the little girl who'd reminded her of herself. Mason knelt beside her, offering what comfort he could, while Maria watched with understanding eyes. "There are others," Maria said quietly. "Dozens of them spread across 3 different locations. The warehouse you saw is just one part of it. Montgomery has arrangements with people in Denver, Santa Fe, even El Paso. It's bigger than you imagined." "How big?" Mason asked. "I saw records in Dr. Patterson's office before I fled. They've been operating for at least 5 years, maybe longer. Hundreds of children, dozens of young women, and it's not just local, they're bringing people in from other territories, other states. The scope of the operation was staggering. Mason had been thinking of this as a local problem, something that could be solved by exposing one corrupt judge in one small town. But if Maria was right, they were dealing with something that reached across the entire Southwest. "We need to get to Cedar Creek," he said finally. "Figure out exactly what we're dealing with before we make any moves." The abandoned mining town sat in a valley between two ridges, its empty buildings like broken teeth against the sky. Most of the structures were falling down, but the old assay office still had a roof and walls solid enough to provide shelter. They made camp there as the sun began to set, Maria proving herself useful by gathering firewood and helping Eleanor prepare a simple meal from their supplies. As they ate, Maria filled in more details about Montgomery's organization. The judge controlled everything through a network of corrupt officials, intimidated townspeople, and hired killers like Garrett. Dr. Patterson provided medical cover for the operation, while various businessmen in Redemption laundered money and provided legitimate fronts for the trafficking. "The worst part," Maria said, staring into the fire, "is how many people know and do nothing. The sheriff, the mayor, half the town council. They're either part of it or too scared to speak up." "Not everyone," Eleanor said. "There has to be someone in Redemption with a conscience." "Maybe. But finding them without exposing ourselves will be the challenge." Mason had been quiet during most of this conversation, thinking about the tactical situation. 3 people against an entrenched criminal organization with political protection and an unknown number of armed enforcers. In his bounty hunting days, he'd faced long odds before, but never anything quite like this. "We need information," he said finally. "Detailed information about their operations, their security, their schedules, and we need it without alerting them to our presence." "I might be able to help with that," Maria said. "I still have friends in town. People who worked at the clinic shopkeepers I knew. If I went in alone, disguised, I could gather intelligence without raising suspicions." "Too dangerous," Eleanor objected. "If Montgomery's men recognize you—" "They won't. I've been living rough for 3 days and I know how to blend in. Besides, you two are too recognizable." Mason's reputation preceded him, and they're actively hunting you, Eleanor. It was a sound plan, but Mason didn't like sending anyone into danger alone. "What about extraction? If something goes wrong, how do we get you out?" "There's an old Spanish mission about 2 miles outside town," Maria explained. "Abandoned, but the bell tower is still standing. If I'm not back by sunset tomorrow, or if I need emergency extraction, I'll signal from there, 3 fires visible from here." They spent the rest of the evening planning. Maria would enter Redemption at dawn, posing as a drifter looking for work. She'd visit the places she knew, gather what information she could, and return before dark. Meanwhile, Mason and Eleanor would scout the approaches to town, looking for escape routes and defensive positions. As they prepared to settle in for the night, Eleanor pulled Mason aside. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked, involving Maria planning what amounts to a war against these people. "You having second thoughts? About stopping them, never. But about the cost," she gestured toward Maria, who was checking her weapons with professional efficiency. "She's risking her life for children she barely knows. You're risking yours for a woman you just met. At what point does the price become too high?" Mason thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made to her grave, about the path that had led him to this moment. "My wife used to say that doing the right thing wasn't about the cost, it was about being able to live with yourself afterward. If we walk away now, how many more children disappear? How many more women get sold like cattle? And if we get killed trying to stop it, then at least we died fighting instead of hiding." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I just needed to hear you say it, because once we start down this road, there's no going back." "I know." "And you're prepared for that, to become the Undertaker again?" Mason was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the man he'd been and the man he was trying to become. "I'm prepared to become whatever I need to be to stop this." Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the moment they'd all been dreading. Maria checked her disguise one final time, dirt smudged on her face clothes, deliberately torn, and patched hair, braided in a different style. She looked like any other drifter seeking work in a frontier town. "Remember," Mason said as she prepared to mount her horse, "if anything feels wrong, get out immediately. The information isn't worth your life." "Those children might disagree with you," Maria replied. but I'll be careful." They watched her ride away until she disappeared over the ridge, then began their own reconnaissance of the area around Redemption. From a high overlook, they could see the town spread out below, bigger than Mason had expected, maybe 800 people with several substantial buildings that suggested real wealth. There, Eleanor pointed to a large structure on the outskirts of town. "That warehouse, it matches the description from my memories." Mason studied the building through his field glasses. It was heavily guarded with at least 4 men visible from their position. The security was too obvious, too professional for a legitimate business. "That's where they're keeping them," he said. "How many guards do you think? Hard to say from here, but if they're smart, they'll have more men inside, probably rotating shifts. Taking that place by force would be—" He paused, thinking about the tactical challenges. "It would be extremely difficult." They spent the rest of the day mapping escape routes and studying the town's layout. By afternoon, they'd identified 3 possible ways in and out of Redemption, 2 of which could be blocked easily by a determined pursuit. The third was a treacherous mountain trail that would be almost impossible to follow at night, but equally dangerous for anyone trying to use it. As evening approached, they returned to Cedar Creek to wait for Maria's signal. The mission bell tower was clearly visible from their position, and they took turns watching it through the field glasses. Sunset came and went with no sign of Maria, then an hour past sunset, then 2. "Something's wrong," Eleanor said. Mason was thinking the same thing, but he forced himself to remain calm. She said sunset, but that doesn't mean exactly at sunset. Give her until full dark. But when the stars came out, and there was still no sign of their ally, Mason knew they had a decision to make. Either Maria had been captured or killed, or she'd found something so important that she was willing to risk exposure to learn more. "We go in," Eleanor said, reading his thoughts. "Tonight, while we still have a chance of finding her." That's exactly what they'd expect us to do. Could be a trap. Could be. But if it's not, if she's in trouble because she was helping us— Eleanor shook her head. "I won't abandon someone the way I was abandoned." Mason looked at this woman who'd been broken and brutalized but still insisted on risking everything for others. Sarah would have made the same choice, he realized, would have walked into hell itself if it meant saving an innocent life. "All right," he said. "But we do this smart. No charging in with guns blazing. We scout first, gather information, then make our move." As they prepared to leave Cedar Creek, possibly forever, Mason found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 3 days ago, he'd been a retired bounty hunter trying to live quietly on a failing ranch. Now he was preparing to assault a criminal stronghold to rescue children he'd never met, and a woman he'd known for less than a day. But as he looked at Eleanor checking her weapons with steady hands, he realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. They were simply who you were when everything else was stripped away. The ride to Redemption took 2 hours through treacherous mountain terrain. They approached from the east using a dry creek bed for cover and left their horses hidden in a grove of cottonwoods a mile from town. The final approach would be on foot using darkness and stealth instead of speed. As they crept closer to the edge of town, Mason caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. 3 fires burned atop the mission bell tower, Maria's emergency signal. But the fires had been burning for hours, judging by how low they'd gotten, which meant either Maria had been trying to signal them since afternoon, or someone else had lit those fires as bait for a trap. "What do you think?" Eleanor whispered. Mason studied the town through his field glasses. Everything looked normal: lights and windows, people moving around, no obvious signs of unusual activity. But something felt wrong, some instinct honed by years of hunting dangerous men, telling him that death was waiting in those quiet streets. "I think," he said slowly, "that we're about to find out just how far we're willing to go for justice." The decision came naturally, born from the same instinct that had kept Mason alive through 7 years of bounty hunting. They would approach the mission from the blind side, using the broken terrain and scattered ruins for cover. If Maria was there, they'd extract her. If it was a trap, they'd spring it on their own terms. Moving through Redemption's outskirts required every skill Mason had learned, tracking dangerous men across hostile territory. Eleanor proved surprisingly adept at moving silently, her smaller frame allowing her to slip through spaces that would have challenged him. They communicated through hand signals, each covering the other as they worked their way toward the old Spanish mission. The building loomed against the star-filled sky, its bell tower dark, except for the 3 signal fires that still flickered weakly. Mason counted at least 2 guards positioned around the mission's perimeter, their cigarette tips glowing like fireflies in the darkness. Professional placement overlapping fields of fire, these weren't local toughs but experienced killers. 4 men minimum, he whispered to Eleanor as they crouched behind a crumbling wall. Maybe more inside. Eleanor studied the guards' positions through his field glasses. The one by the main entrance keeps checking his pocket watch. They're waiting for something. Or someone. The trap was obvious now, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. Maria's signal fires meant she was either inside that mission or dead, and either way, Montgomery's men were using her as bait. The smart play would be to retreat, regroup, find another way to gather intelligence. But as Mason watched those signal fires burning, he thought about a little girl named Catherine O'Brien, who called herself 16, about children who'd been reduced to numbers in a ledger about Maria Santos, who'd risked everything to help strangers. Sometimes the smart play wasn't the right play. I'm going to circle around to the back, he told Eleanor. Give me 20 minutes, then create a distraction at the front entrance. Nothing dramatic, just make enough noise to draw their attention. What kind of distraction? You'll think of something. You're resourceful. Eleanor's smile was fierce in the starlight. That's one word for it. Mason made his way around the mission's perimeter, using shadows and ruins for cover. The back entrance was guarded by a single man who seemed more interested in a bottle of whiskey than watching for intruders. Sloppy, but Mason had seen overconfidence get good men killed before. As he positioned himself for the approach, a sound from inside the mission made him freeze, a woman's voice raised in anger. Maria was alive and she was fighting. You can torture me all you want, her voice carried clearly through the broken walls. I'm not telling you where they are. A man's voice answered, cultured and calm. Miss Santos, torture is such an unpleasant word. We prefer to think of this as persuasion, and you will tell us what we want to know because the alternative is so much worse than death. Judge Montgomery, I presume, Maria replied, her voice steady despite whatever they were doing to her. You're exactly as pathetic as I imagined. The sound of a slap echoed from inside, followed by Montgomery's voice, no longer calm. Your friends are coming for you, my dear. Our watchers saw them approaching from the east. When they arrive, we'll kill the man quickly. Professional courtesy for a fellow killer. But the woman we'll take our time with. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to spare them that unpleasantness by being more cooperative. Mason felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, the same emotion that had driven him through countless manhunts. But this time it was different, focused, purposeful, righteous. These men thought they could use Maria's compassion against her, threaten innocent lives to break her will. They were about to learn why Mason Sinclair had never failed to bring in his target. The guard at the back entrance never saw him coming. Mason's knife found the man's throat before he could cry out, and he lowered the body silently to the ground. The back door was barred from inside, but the mission's ancient walls had crumbled in several places, creating gaps large enough for a man to slip through. Inside, Mason found himself in what had once been the mission's sacristy. Moonlight streamed through broken roof tiles, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the air. Voices came from the main chapel, Montgomery, and at least 2 other men, probably more. Mason checked his weapons one final time, then began moving toward the voices. Each step had to be perfect, each footfall silent. Discovery now would mean death for all of them. As he reached the entrance to the main chapel, Eleanor's distraction began. Her voice carried across the mission grounds, high and frightened. Help, please, someone help me. My horse threw me and I think I broke my ankle. The response was immediate. 2 of Montgomery's men moved toward the front entrance, their boots echoing in the chapel as they passed Mason's hiding place. That left the judge and probably 1 other man with Maria. How touching. Montgomery's voice drifted from the altar area. The little dove has come to rescue her friend. Garrett, go collect our guest. Try not to damage her too badly, she's worth more intact. Perfect. That left Montgomery alone with Maria, at least for the next few minutes. Mason slipped into the chapel proper, using the rows of broken pews for cover. Near the altar, he could see Maria tied to a chair. Her face bloodied, but her eyes still defiant. Montgomery stood beside her, a well-dressed man in his 50s with the soft look of someone who'd never done his own killing. Where are they hiding? Montgomery was asking. Your friends from the mountains. Tell me and I'll make their deaths quick. Go to hell, Maria spat. Montgomery backhanded her casually, the way a man might swat a fly. Such language from a lady. Though I suppose working with those filthy immigrants and street orphans has coarsened your vocabulary. Mason had heard enough. He rose from behind the pews like death itself, his Colts appearing in his hands with practiced ease. Judge Montgomery. The man spun around, his face going pale as he recognized the figure standing in the moonlight. Mason Sinclair, I should have known you'd come. You should have minded your own business instead of trafficking children. Montgomery's composure returned quickly, the confidence of a man accustomed to buying his way out of trouble. Children. My dear fellow, you've been misinformed. I run legitimate businesses. Shut up. Mason's voice was quiet, deadly. Maria, you hurt. Nothing that won't heal, she replied, though Mason could see the pain in her eyes. But Mason, there are more guards. The sound of gunfire from outside cut her off. Eleanor's distraction had apparently become something more serious. As I was saying, Montgomery continued, apparently unperturbed by the violence, you've stumbled into something much larger than you understand. This operation has protection at the highest levels. Territorial governors, federal marshals, even senators back in Washington. Kill me and you'll have the entire government hunting you. Maybe. But you'll still be dead. For the first time, real fear flickered in Montgomery's eyes. What do you want? Money, I can make you wealthy beyond your dreams. Position, I have influence throughout the territory. Women, I have access to the finest. I want you to shut your mouth while I decide whether to kill you quick or slow. The judge fell silent, finally understanding that he was facing someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or reasoned with. Mason had become something beyond negotiation. He was justice itself, implacable and final. But before Mason could make his decision, the sound of boots on stone announced the return of Montgomery's men. Too many boots, too quickly. Eleanor's distraction had failed and they were about to be surrounded. Maria, Mason said urgently, can you ride? If I have to. Mason shot through her ropes with surgical precision, freeing her hands while keeping his eyes on Montgomery. When I say run, you head for the back entrance. There's a gap in the wall and our horses are hidden in the cottonwoods to the east. What about you? I'll be right behind you. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Someone had to hold off Montgomery's men long enough for the others to escape, and Mason was the only one with the skills to do it. But before he could give the order to run, Eleanor appeared in the chapel doorway, her rifle in her hands and fire in her eyes. The guards are down, she announced calmly, but there are more coming from town. We have maybe 10 minutes before this place is surrounded. Mason stared at her in amazement. You took out 4 armed men. 3. The 4th one ran. Eleanor's smile was grim. Turns out all those years of hunting rabbits with my father translated well to hunting men. Montgomery looked between them, his composure finally cracking. You're all insane. You can't fight an entire organization. Even if you escape tonight, we'll hunt you down. We have resources you can't imagine. Then you'd better pray we don't escape, Eleanor replied, because if we do, we're coming for every single one of you. Maria had freed herself from the remaining ropes and was testing her ability to move. She was hurt but functional, which was all they could ask for under the circumstances. Judge Montgomery. Mason said, his gun still trained on the man. You're going to tell us everything where the children are being held, who's involved, how the operation works. You're going to give us names, locations, everything we need to shut you down. And if I refuse, then you die right here, right now, and we figure it out ourselves. Montgomery's laugh was bitter. You think you're the heroes in this story? You're nothing but small-town vigilantes interfering with forces beyond your comprehension. This operation serves important people, provides necessary services. Necessary. Maria's voice was filled with fury. Those children aren't services. They're human beings. They have names, families, dreams. They have value, Montgomery interrupted. In a harsh world, that's more than most people can say. The casual evil of the statement struck them all silent for a moment. Here was a man who'd reduced children to commodities, who spoke of human trafficking as if it were a legitimate business venture. Mason felt something fundamental shift inside him. The man who'd tried to leave violence behind was gone, replaced by something older and infinitely more dangerous. This wasn't about justice anymore, it was about extermination. Last chance, he said quietly. Start talking, or I start shooting. Montgomery must have seen death in Mason's eyes because his defiance finally crumbled. "There are 3 main locations," he said quickly. "The warehouse you've already seen, a ranch house 20 miles south of here, and a way station near the Colorado border. The children are moved regularly, never staying in one place more than a few weeks." "How many children total?" I don't keep exact counts. Maybe 60, 70. The numbers change constantly." Eleanor made a sound of disgust. 60 children and you don't even know how many. The operation is complex, Montgomery defended. There are supply chains, distribution networks, client demands to manage to clients. Mason's voice was deadly quiet. "Give me names." "I can't. They'd kill me if... I'll kill you if you don't." The sound of approaching horses interrupted them, multiple riders moving fast. Montgomery's reinforcements were arriving and escape was about to become impossible. "We have to go," Eleanor said urgently. "Now." But Mason wasn't finished. In one swift motion, he grabbed Montgomery by the throat and pressed his gun to the man's temple. "Names, right now, or your brains decorate this altar." "Caldwell." Montgomery gasped. "Senator Caldwell is the main client. He has a ranch in Colorado where he entertains important visitors. There's a banker in Denver, Morrison, who handles the finances, a federal marshal named Thompson who provides protection, and others, many others." "Locations. Where exactly?" "Caldwell's ranch is called the Circle C, 40 miles north of Pueblo. Morrison's bank is on Larimer Street in Denver. Thompson operates out of the federal building there. But you can't touch them. They're too well connected, too powerful." The sound of horses was getting closer. Maria had reached the back entrance and was motioning frantically for them to follow. "One more question," Mason said, his grip tightening on Montgomery's throat. "The warehouse here in Redemption, how many guards? What's the layout?" 8 men during the day, 12 at night. 2 entrances, both heavily defended. Motion them, and Mason struck him with the butt of his gun, dropping the judge unconscious to the chapel floor. "Let's go." They ran through the mission's ruins as the sound of horses grew louder. Behind them, torches appeared in the distance, a dozen riders at least, maybe more. Eleanor led the way to the gap in the wall while Mason covered their retreat, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. The cottonwood grove where they'd hidden their horses seemed impossibly far away, an open stretch of ground that would leave them completely exposed. But there was no choice. They had to reach the horses before Montgomery's men surrounded the mission. "There!" Maria pointed toward the trees. "I can see thunder." They ran across the open ground expecting bullets to start flying at any moment, but the darkness worked in their favor, making them difficult targets for anyone not using professional equipment. They reached the horses just as shouts erupted from the mission behind them. "They're searching the building," Eleanor panted as she mounted Star. "That gives us maybe 5 minutes before they figure out we escaped." "Which way?" Maria asked, settling gingerly onto her paint horse. Mason looked back toward Redemption, then at the 2 women who'd thrown their lot in with his. Eleanor, the governess who'd found steel in her spine. Maria, the clinic worker who'd risked everything for strangers. Both of them looking to him for leadership, trusting him to get them out of this alive. "North," he decided, "toward Colorado. If Montgomery was telling the truth, that's where we'll find the real power behind this operation. And if he was lying, then we'll figure it out when we get there." They rode hard through the night, using game trails and dry creek beds to avoid leaving obvious tracks. Behind them, the lights of Redemption faded into darkness, but Mason knew their troubles were just beginning. Montgomery would survive, men like him always did, and he'd have every available gun looking for them within hours. But as the miles passed beneath their horses' hooves, Mason found himself thinking not about the dangers ahead, but about the children still trapped in that warehouse. 60 or 70 young lives reduced to numbers in a ledger waiting for someone to save them. Eleanor rode beside him, her face set with determination despite the exhaustion he could see in her posture. "We're really doing this," she said, "taking on senators and federal marshals and God knows who else. Second thoughts? No, just processing the scope of what we're up against." "It's bigger than I thought, too," Mason admitted. "But that doesn't change what needs to be done." Maria guided her horse closer to them. "There's something else Montgomery said that worries me. He mentioned client demand supply chains. This isn't just about the children currently held, they're constantly bringing in new ones." The implications hit them all simultaneously. Every day they spent gathering information, planning their attack, More children disappeared into Montgomery's network. Every hour of delay meant more lives destroyed. "How long do you think we have," Eleanor asked, "before they move the children again?" "Hard to say. But if Montgomery follows standard criminal procedure, he'll move them immediately. Assume we know about the warehouse, assume we might try to rescue them. So we lost our chance." "Maybe. Or maybe we force them to move the children somewhere less secure, somewhere we can actually reach them." They rode on through the night, each lost in their own thoughts about the battle ahead. Mason found himself thinking about Sarah again, about the last conversation they'd had before he left to pursue his final bounty. She'd begged him to walk away to find another path, to choose love over vengeance. He'd refused, convinced that justice required violence, that some men could only be stopped by force. Now, 3 years later, he was riding toward another confrontation, another chance to choose between violence and walking away. But this time was different. This time he wasn't hunting for money or reputation. He was fighting for children who couldn't fight for themselves, for women who'd been reduced to property, for the idea that some things were worth dying for. This time, Sarah would have ridden beside him. Dawn found them in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, their horses exhausted and their own stamina nearly spent. They made camp in a hidden valley with good sight lines and multiple escape routes, posting watch while the others tried to rest. "We need supplies," Maria said as she tended a cut on her horse's leg. "Food, ammunition, medical supplies, and we need information about what's waiting for us in Colorado." "There's a trading post about 30 miles northeast," Mason replied, "run by a man named Charlie Beckworth. He used to provide information for the Territorial Marshal's office back when it was honest. If anyone knows about federal corruption in Colorado, it'll be Charlie." Eleanor looked up from cleaning her rifle. "Can we trust him?" "As much as we can trust anyone. Charlie's got no love for corrupt officials, and he hates child traffickers even more." Mason paused, remembering something. He lost his own daughter to slavers back in '87. Never got over it? Then he'll help us, if he believes we can actually do something about it. They spent the day resting and planning, taking turns on watch while the others slept. Mason used the time to study his maps, plotting routes to Colorado and identifying potential allies along the way. The scope of Montgomery's operation was daunting: federal protection, political connections, vast financial resources, but it also created weaknesses. The bigger the conspiracy, the more people involved, the greater the chance someone would make a mistake. As evening approached, they prepared to resume their journey. The trading post was a hard day's ride through mountain terrain, but it would put them that much closer to Colorado and the next phase of their mission. "Mason," Eleanor said as they saddled their horses, "what happens if we succeed, if we actually manage to expose this whole network?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what happens to us? We'll have made enemies of some very powerful people, federal marshals, senators, bankers. They won't just forget about us." Mason considered the question seriously. In his bounty hunting days, he'd never thought much about what came after the job was done. But now, looking at Eleanor and Maria, he realized they deserved honest answers about the price of justice. "If we succeed," he said slowly, "we'll probably have to disappear. New names, new lives somewhere far from here. It's not much of a future to offer." "Better than no future at all," Maria replied, "and better than letting those children suffer while we stay safe." Eleanor nodded agreement. "Besides, what kind of life would it be knowing we could have stopped this and chose not to?" As they rode out of their hidden valley and back onto the mountain trails, Mason found himself thinking about endings and beginnings. 3 days ago, he'd been a man trying to escape his past. Now, he was riding toward a future that might see him dead or exiled, but which would finally give meaning to all the violence in his life. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, Montgomery's men were undoubtedly still searching. Ahead in Colorado, powerful men were going about their business, confident that their money and influence made them untouchable. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The trail wound higher into the mountains, carrying them toward whatever awaited in the darkness ahead. And somewhere in warehouses and ranch houses and way stations scattered across the territory, children were waiting for rescue that might never come. Unless 3 people with nothing left to lose could find a way to stop an empire built on human suffering. The mountain trail twisted like a serpent's spine through terrain that seemed designed to break both horses and riders. By the time they reached Charlie Beckworth's trading post, Mason's legs ached from gripping his saddle through countless switchbacks and their horses' heads hung low with exhaustion. The post sat in a natural clearing where two valleys converged, positioned to serve travelers coming from any direction, but defensible against unwanted visitors. Charlie emerged from his cabin before they'd even dismounted a weathered man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He held a rifle casually, but ready, studying the three strangers with the wariness of someone who'd survived on the frontier through careful judgment. "Mason Sinclair," he said after a long moment. "Heard you'd retired from the killing business." "Heard right. But sometimes the business won't let you retire." Charlie's gaze shifted to Eleanor and Maria, taking in their travel-worn appearance and the weapons they carried with easy familiarity. "These ladies don't look like the usual company you kept." "They're not. Charlie Beckworth, meet Eleanor Winter and Maria Santos. They're the reason I'm back in the business." Something in Mason's tone must have conveyed the gravity of their situation, because Charlie's expression softened slightly. "Come inside. You all look like you could use coffee and a hot meal." The interior of Charlie's cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with shelves lined with trade goods and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Maps covered nearly every surface, marked with routes and notations in Charlie's careful handwriting. This was clearly a man who made his living by knowing the territory better than anyone else. As Charlie poured coffee and Maria began preparing a simple meal from their supplies, Mason spread his own map on the table and explained their situation. He held nothing back: the trafficking network, Montgomery's organization, the children still trapped somewhere in the wilderness. Charlie listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "Senator Caldwell," Charlie said when Mason finished, "should have known that bastard was involved in something like this. He's been buying up land all through southern Colorado, claiming it's for cattle ranching. But I've seen the kind of men he hires, not cowboys, that's for certain. You know his operation, know of it. The Circle C Ranch is more fortress than working spread. High walls guard towers, men with rifles patrolling the perimeter. Locals in Pueblo say strange things about that place: shipments arriving at night, screams carrying on the wind, people who go to work there and never come home." Eleanor leaned forward intently. "How many people are we talking about, guard staff? How big is his private army?" "Hard to say exactly. Maybe 30-40 men, could be more. Caldwell's got enough money to hire the best killers on the frontier." Charlie paused, studying Eleanor's face. "You're planning to hit the place, aren't you? 3 people against a fortified compound full of professional gunmen." "We're planning to rescue the children," Eleanor corrected. "However many it takes." Charlie was quiet for a long moment, then walked to a cabinet and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. He poured himself a shot, drank it down, and poured another. "7 years ago," he said finally, "my daughter Sarah was traveling to Denver with a church group, supposed to be safe, good people, armed escort, well-traveled road, but they never made it to Denver. Found the escort dead beside the trail. The church folks scattered or missing. Sarah was 16 years old, prettiest girl in 3 counties. Mason exchanged glances with Eleanor. Neither of them spoke, recognizing the weight of memory in Charlie's voice. "Spent 2 years looking for. Meet some to her." Charlie continued. "Followed every lead, chased every rumor, paid every informant I could find. Never found so much as a trace. Until last winter, when a dying man told me about a place in Mexico where American girls were sold to wealthy buyers. Described my Sarah down to the birthmark on her left shoulder." The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Charlie stared into his whiskey glass as if it held answers to questions that had tormented him for years. "Point is," he said, looking up at them, "I know what you're up against. Not just the men with guns, but the hopelessness of it. The feeling that you're fighting something too big, too connected, too protected to ever really stop. But you're still here," Maria said quietly. "Still helping people travel safely through the territory. Because giving up means they win. And because maybe someday someone like you 3 comes along, someone crazy enough to actually try to stop them." Charlie walked to another cabinet and began pulling out items: ammunition, medical supplies, dried food, even a detailed map of southern Colorado marked with routes and landmarks. "If you're really going to do this," he said. You'll need more than courage and good intentions. You'll need intelligence supplies and a plan that accounts for the fact that Caldwell's operation has survived this long by being smarter and better funded than anyone who's tried to stop it. Mason studied the map Charlie had provided. The Circle C ranch was marked in red ink with notations about guard positions, patrol schedules, and access routes. You've been watching the place. For 2 years. Part of me kept hoping I'd see Sarah there, that somehow she'd survived and I could get her back. Mostly I just gathered information thinking maybe someday it would be useful. It's useful now, Eleanor said, tracing the ranch's perimeter with her finger. These patrol routes, they're predictable, regular as clockwork. Caldwell runs his operation like a military campaign. Same routes, same times, same procedures. It's effective, but it also creates patterns that can be exploited. Maria had been studying the medical supplies Charlie had provided. Laudanum, chloroform, morphine, these aren't standard trading post inventory. No, they're not. I've been preparing for this day for a long time, hoping someone would come along with the skills and determination to use them properly. Charlie's smile was grim. The laudanum can be mixed with water to keep rescued children calm during transport. The chloroform can incapacitate guards quietly. The morphine, well, some of those children might need serious medical attention. The scope of Charlie's preparation struck them all silent. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a convergence of purpose that seemed almost predestined. A father seeking justice for his lost daughter, a governess determined to save other children, a clinic worker driven by professional ethics, and a retired gunfighter looking for redemption. There's something else, Charlie said, walking to a locked chest in the corner of the cabin. Something I've been saving for the right moment. Inside the chest, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a rifle unlike anything Mason had ever seen. The barrel was longer than standard, with precision sights and a crafted stock that spoke of master gunsmithing. Whitworth rifle, Charlie explained. English-made, designed for long-range shooting, accurate to 800 yards in the right hands. I bought it from a Confederate sharpshooter after the war, thinking maybe I'd need it someday to reach targets that standard weapons couldn't touch. Eleanor whistled softly. That could change everything. With that range, we could take out sentries from positions they'd never expect. Can you shoot it? Charlie asked her. I can shoot anything with a trigger. The question is whether I can shoot it well enough to matter. We'll test it tomorrow morning, Mason decided. Charlie, what about escape routes? Assume we get the children out. Where do we take them? Charlie pointed to several locations on his map. There's a mission station about 40 miles northeast of the Circle C. Father Miguel runs it good, man. No love for corruption. He'd hide the children until we could figure out permanent arrangements. There's also a cavalry outpost at Fort Collins. But I wouldn't trust them. Too many federal connections. The mission sounds better anyway, Maria agreed. Father Miguel could provide medical care, and religious sanctuary might offer some legal protection. They spent the rest of the evening planning, using Charlie's intelligence to develop a strategy for approaching the Circle C ranch. The compound was too well defended for a direct assault, but Charlie's maps revealed potential weaknesses, blind spots in the patrol routes, areas where the perimeter was less heavily fortified, times when guard shifts changed and coverage might be thin. The best opportunity is Sunday mornings, Charlie explained. Caldwell attends church in Pueblo more for appearances than piety and takes half his men with him as escort. That leaves the ranch with minimal security for about 4 hours. How do we know the children will be there on a Sunday? Eleanor asked. Because they're never moved on Sundays. Caldwell's superstitious about conducting business on the Sabbath, says it's bad luck. Mason found himself thinking about the irony of using a man's religious pretensions against him. But if Caldwell wanted to play the part of a respectable citizen while trafficking children, he'd have to live with the constraints that role imposed. Distance from here to the ranch, he asked. 3 days hard riding, 4 if we're being careful about not leaving tracks. We're being careful, Eleanor said firmly. No point in rescuing the children if we lead Caldwell's men straight to them afterward. As they prepared to settle in for the night, Charlie pulled Mason aside for a private conversation. You sure about this, Mason? I mean, really sure. Because once you hit Caldwell's operation, there's no going back. He's got connections in Washington, friends in the territorial government, enough money to hire every gun between here and Texas. I'm sure. And the women, they understand what they're signing up for. Mason looked across the cabin at Eleanor and Maria, quietly discussing escape routes and contingency plans. They understand better than I do. They've seen what Caldwell's people do to children. They've lived through it. Charlie nodded slowly. Good. Because this isn't going to be like your old bounty hunting jobs. You're not just going after one man, you're taking on an entire system. Even if you succeed, even if you get the children out safely, the network will still exist. Other men will step into Caldwell's place. Maybe, but those specific children will be free, and maybe our success will inspire others to act. Or maybe it'll just make the network more careful, harder to find and stop. Mason considered this soberly. You having second thoughts about helping us? No, just making sure you know what you're choosing. Charlie's expression was grave. My Sarah's been gone 7 years. Nothing I do now will bring her back. But those children at the Circle C Ranch, they still have a chance. That makes the risk worthwhile. Dawn brought cold mountain air and the crisp clarity that came with high altitude. After a breakfast of coffee and hardtack, they moved to Charlie's shooting range, a natural clearing that offered shots at distances up to 1,000 yards. Eleanor handled the Whitworth rifle with the same careful competence she'd shown with every other weapon, adjusting the sights and testing the trigger pull before attempting her first shot. The target was a wooden board marked with a rough human silhouette positioned at 400 yards. Eleanor's first shot was wide by 6 inches, respectable for an unfamiliar weapon at that distance, but not good enough for their purposes. The sight picture's different from what I'm used to, she explained, making adjustments. But I can compensate. Her second shot was closer, and by the 5th attempt she was consistently hitting center mass. Charlie watched with professional interest, occasionally offering suggestions about breathing and trigger control. You're a natural, he said, after Eleanor put 3 consecutive shots into a 6-inch group. With a few more hours of practice, you could make this rifle sing. They spent the morning refining Eleanor's technique, while Mason and Maria studied the maps and finalized their approach strategy. The plan was ambitious, but not impossible. Infiltrate the ranch during Sunday morning services, locate and extract the children, then disappear into the mountains before Caldwell returned. The main risk is the unknown, Maria pointed out. We don't know how many children are there, what condition they're in, whether they'll be able to travel quickly. We adapt to what we find, Mason replied, but we don't leave anyone behind. By afternoon, they'd developed contingency plans for various scenarios, too many children to move quickly. Hostile children who didn't trust rescuers' pursuit by Caldwell's men, medical emergencies during the escape. Each plan required different resources and skills, but all of them depended on precise timing and flawless execution. There's one more thing, Charlie said as they prepared to leave, something I haven't told you about the Circle C Ranch. Mason looked up from checking his weapons. What is it? There are rumors about Caldwell himself. Local folks say he's not just running the trafficking operation, he's one of the primary customers. Takes personal interest in certain children, keeps them for extended periods before disposing of them. The implications hit them all like physical blows. Eleanor's face went pale, and Maria made a sound of disgust that seemed to come from her soul. How extended? Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. Weeks, sometimes months, and the children who survive that long? Charlie shook his head. They're never the same, broken in ways that don't heal. Mason felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest. But this time it was different, not the professional anger of a bounty hunter, but something deeper and more personal. This wasn't just about stopping a criminal operation anymore. It was about confronting pure evil. If we find Caldwell at the ranch, Mason said quietly, I'm going to kill him. Mason, Eleanor started. No discussion. Men like Caldwell don't deserve trials or second chances. They deserve to die. Charlie studied Mason's face and apparently saw something there that satisfied him. Good. Because if you let him live, he'll never stop hunting you. Men like him can't afford to let challenges to their power go unpunished. As they loaded their supplies and prepared for the journey to Colorado, Mason found himself thinking about justice and vengeance, about the fine line between protecting the innocent and becoming the very evil you fought against. In his bounty hunting days, he'd always brought his targets back alive when possible, partly for the higher bounties, but mostly because he'd believed in the law, in the idea that society should decide guilt and punishment. But Caldwell's crimes went beyond anything the law could adequately address. Some acts were so fundamentally evil that they forfeited the perpetrator's right to exist, and sometimes justice required someone willing to step outside the law to deliver it. "You ready for this?" Eleanor asked as she mounted Star. "As ready as anyone can be for something like this." "Good, because those children are counting on us whether they know it or not." The ride toward Colorado took them through some of the most spectacular terrain Mason had ever seen. Towering peaks that scraped the sky valleys carpeted with aspen trees turning gold in the autumn air. Streams that ran crystal clear over beds of polished stone. Under other circumstances, it would have been a pleasant journey, but knowing what waited at their destination cast a shadow over even the most beautiful vistas. They traveled carefully, avoiding main trails and settlements where possible. Charlie had provided them with a route that would bring them to the Circle C Ranch from an unexpected direction, using old mining roads and cattle trails that appeared on no official maps. It added distance to their journey, but dramatically reduced the chance of being spotted by Caldwell's scouts. On their second night out from Charlie's post, as they made camp in a hidden valley beside a small creek, Maria brought up a concern that had been troubling her. "What if we're too late?" she asked. "What if the children have already been moved or sold or—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Then we find out where they went and follow them," Mason replied. "This doesn't end until every child is free." "But realistically, Mason, we can't save them all. There are networks like this operating across the entire territory, maybe across the whole country. Even if we succeed beyond our wildest hopes, dozens of other children will still be trapped." Eleanor looked up from cleaning her rifle. "So what's the alternative? Give up because we can't save everyone. Let the children at the Circle C Ranch suffer because there are others we can't reach. I'm not saying we give up. I'm saying we need to think about what comes after. If we expose Caldwell's operation, if we get evidence of federal corruption, maybe we can start something bigger than just one rescue mission." Mason had been thinking along similar lines. The network they'd uncovered was too vast and well-connected to be stopped by killing one senator and rescuing one group of children. But maybe their actions could inspire others, could prove that even the most powerful criminals weren't untouchable. "First we save the children we can reach," he said. "Then we worry about changing the world." "Fair enough. But we should document everything we find, names, locations, evidence of federal involvement. If we don't survive this, maybe someone else can use that information." It was a sobering thought, but a necessary one. They were riding toward a confrontation with overwhelming odds, and survival was far from guaranteed. Making sure their deaths would serve some purpose seemed like prudent planning. Their third day brought them to the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, within striking distance of the Circle C Ranch. They made camp early, using the remaining daylight to scout their final approach and review their plans one last time. From a high ridge, they could see Caldwell's compound spread out in the valley below, larger and more fortified than even Charlie's maps had suggested. The main house was a sprawling adobe structure surrounded by high walls and guard towers. Outbuildings scattered across the property suggested a working ranch, but Mason could see the strategic positioning that marked it as primarily a fortress. "Jesus," Eleanor breathed, studying the compound through field glasses. "How many guards do you count?" "8 that I can see from here," Mason replied. "But there will be more inside the buildings, more on patrol routes we can't observe from this angle." Maria had been studying the compound's layout, comparing it to Charlie's maps. "The children are probably being held in that long, low building near the back wall. See how it has fewer windows than the other structures, and those bars." Mason focused his glasses on the building Maria had indicated. She was right. The structure looked more like a prison than anything else, with barred windows and what appeared to be multiple locks on the doors. "Sunday morning," he said, "when Caldwell goes to church. That's our window." "Assuming the children are actually there," Eleanor added, "and assuming we can get past whatever security he leaves behind. And assuming we can move quickly enough to get them all out before he returns," Maria finished. The scope of the challenge was daunting, but not impossible. They had good intelligence, proper equipment, and the advantage of surprise. Most importantly, they had something Caldwell's hired killers lacked: a willingness to die for something bigger than themselves. As night fell over the valley, they made their final preparations. Weapons cleaned and loaded, escape routes, memorized contingency plans rehearsed until they could execute them without conscious thought. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or disaster, rescue or death. But tonight, as Mason lay under the star-filled Colorado sky, he found himself thinking not about the dangers ahead, but about the children sleeping in that prison-like building below. Children who'd been reduced to merchandise, who'd lost their names and identities, who went to sleep each night, wondering if anyone in the world still cared whether they lived or died. Tomorrow, they would have their answer. Sunday morning arrived with a clarity that seemed almost mocking perfect weather for what might be their last day alive. Mason woke before dawn, his internal clock honed by years of dangerous work, and found Eleanor already awake, sitting motionless as she watched the valley below through the field glasses. "Any movement?" he asked quietly. "Guards changed shift about an hour ago. Same routine Charlie described, 6 men visible on the perimeter, probably more inside the buildings." She lowered the glasses and looked at him. "Mason, there's something else. I've been watching that building where we think the children are kept. There's been light in the windows all night." Could mean anything. Guard post, sick child, someone who can't sleep. Or it could mean that they're preparing to move them, today. The possibility hit Mason like cold water. If Caldwell was planning to transport the children, their window of opportunity might close before it ever opened. But there was no way to know for certain without getting closer, and getting closer meant exposing themselves to discovery. Maria joined them as the sun crested the eastern peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. "Beautiful morning for justice," she said, but her voice carried an edge that spoke of nerves and determination in equal measure. "Any regrets?" Mason asked both women. "Last chance to walk away from this." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "Walk away to what? A life knowing I had the chance to save those children and chose safety instead? I'd rather die trying than live with that kind of cowardice." "Same here," Maria agreed. "Besides, we've come too far to quit now." Mason nodded, understanding completely. They'd crossed too many lines, burned too many bridges to turn back now. The only way forward was through whatever hell waited in that valley. At 8 o'clock, their patience was rewarded. The compound's main gates opened and a procession emerged that would have been impressive under different circumstances. Senator Caldwell rode in an ornate carriage flanked by a dozen mounted guards in their finest clothes. The show of wealth and power was clearly intended to impress the citizens of Pueblo, to reinforce Caldwell's image as a successful businessman and respected political figure. "Arrogant bastard," Eleanor muttered, watching through the glasses. "Rides to church like he's some kind of king while children suffer in his dungeons." "His arrogance works in our favor," Mason pointed out. "Makes him predictable." They waited until the procession disappeared over the southern ridge before beginning their descent into the valley. The route Charlie had mapped for them used a dry creek bed and scattered boulders for cover, bringing them to within 200 yards of the compound's north wall. From there, they could see the guards more clearly. 4 men visible on the walls, moving in lazy patterns that suggested boredom rather than alertness. "Just like Charlie said," Maria whispered. "Skeleton crew during church hours." Mason studied the guards' positions and timing. "Eleanor, can you reach that tower with the Whitworth?" She measured the distance with her eyes, accounting for wind and elevation. 300 yards, maybe 320. Well within range. "Take position here. If shooting starts, take out the tower guards first. They have the best view of the compound. Maria and I will go over the wall and find the children." "What if there are more guards inside than we planned for?" "Then we adapt. But we don't retreat until every child is accounted for." Eleanor found a shooting position among the rocks, the Whitworth's barrel resting on a natural rest that gave her a stable platform. "I've got clear sight lines to both towers and the main courtyard. If you get into trouble, I can provide covering fire." Mason checked his weapons one final time. Both Colts loaded extra ammunition in his belt, a knife in his boot for silent work. Maria carried her rifle and a bag of medical supplies, prepared for whatever condition they might find the children in. "Remember," he told her as they approached the wall, "we go in quiet. Get the children, get out. No heroics, no unnecessary risks." "Understood." "But Mason, if we find Caldwell?" "He's not supposed to be here. He went to church, remember?" "I know what he's supposed to have done, but men like him don't always follow their own patterns when it matters most." The possibility that they might encounter Caldwell himself hadn't figured prominently in their planning, But Mason realized it should have. A man paranoid enough to build a fortress wouldn't necessarily trust his security to subordinates during a potentially vulnerable time. The north wall was 8 feet high, built of adobe bricks that provided handholds for climbing. Mason went up first, peering cautiously over the top before dropping silently into the compound. The courtyard was empty except for a few chickens pecking at scattered grain. Normal ranch sounds drifted from the outbuildings, horses moving in their stalls, the distant lowing of cattle. Maria landed beside him with cat-like grace, and they moved quickly toward the building they'd identified as a probable prison. Up close, its purpose was unmistakable: barred windows, reinforced doors, walls thick enough to muffle screams. The sight made Mason's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain focused on the task at hand. The first door was locked, but the mechanism was simple enough that Maria's lockpicks had it open in less than a minute. The corridor beyond was dimly lit and eerily quiet, with heavy wooden doors lining both sides. Each door had a small barred window at eye level, and the smell that pervaded the building spoke of unwashed bodies, fear, and despair. The first cell they checked was empty, but the second contained a sight that stopped them both cold. A young girl, maybe 12 years old, sat huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with terror as they peered through the bars. She wore a simple gray dress that had once been white, and her hair had been roughly cut short. "It's all right," Maria whispered through the bars. "We're here to help." The girl stared at them without speaking, her eyes holding the hollow look of someone who'd learned that hope was dangerous. Mason worked on the cell lock while Maria continued trying to reassure the child. When the door swung open, the girl pressed herself further into the corner, clearly expecting violence. "My name is Maria," she said gently, kneeling down to the girl's level. "What's your name?" 14, came the whispered reply. The casual cruelty of reducing a child to a number made Mason's hands shake with rage, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Your real name," Maria pressed gently. "The name your parents gave you." The girl's forehead wrinkled with effort, as if trying to remember something from a distant dream. "Lucy," she said finally. "Lucy Morrison. That's a beautiful name. Lucy, we're going to get you out of here, but I need you to be very brave and very quiet. Can you do that?" Lucy nodded, allowing Maria to help her to her feet. She was thin to the point of malnutrition, and Mason could see old bruises on her arms. Whatever these children had endured went far beyond simple imprisonment. They found 11 more children in the cells. Boys and girls ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 15, all bearing the same hollow-eyed look of systematic abuse. Some gave their real names readily, others could only remember their assigned numbers, and a few didn't speak at all. The sight of so much suffering concentrated in one place was almost overwhelming, but Mason forced himself to think tactically. "We can't move them all at once," he told Maria quietly. "They're too weak, too scared. It'll take multiple trips." "Or we find another way," Maria replied, studying the children. "Some of them can't walk far, and all of them are going to need medical attention soon." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their discussion. Through the barred windows, Mason could see dust clouds approaching from the south, too early for Caldwell's return from church, but definitely multiple riders moving fast. "Patrol returning," he said grimly. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they reach the compound. Not enough time to get the children out. No, but enough time to get them ready to move." Mason knelt down to address the children directly. "Listen to me, all of you. We're going to take you somewhere safe away from here. But first there are some bad men coming and we have to deal with them. When the loud noises start, you stay here and keep quiet. Maria will stay with you. When I come back, we'll all leave together." A boy who looked about 10 raised his hand tentatively. "Are you going to kill the bad men?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mason looked into the boy's eyes and saw not fear but hope, the desperate hope of someone who'd prayed for rescue for so long that he'd almost stopped believing it was possible. "Yes," Mason said simply. "I'm going to kill them." The boy nodded solemnly, and Mason saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been satisfaction. Mason left Maria with the children and made his way back to the courtyard. The approaching riders were close now. 6 men riding hard, their horses lathered with sweat. Something had spooked them, sent them racing back to the compound ahead of schedule. Mason positioned himself behind a water trough with clear sightlines to the main gate, his Colts ready. The riders burst through the gate at full gallop, their leader shouting orders before his horse had even stopped. "Check the perimeter. Someone's been watching the compound, found fresh tracks on the north ridge." Mason's blood ran cold. They'd been careful, but apparently not careful enough. Somehow, Caldwell's men had discovered their surveillance position, which meant Eleanor was in immediate danger. The men scattered across the courtyard, drawing weapons and moving with the efficiency of experienced soldiers. These weren't local toughs or hired thugs, they were professionals, and they knew how to respond to a threat. Mason's first shot took the leader's center mass, dropping him from his saddle before the others realized they were under attack. His second shot caught another man turning toward the sound, spinning him around before he hit the ground. The remaining four dove for cover, shouting warnings and returning fire. The courtyard erupted in gunfire bullets, chipping adobe walls and ricocheting off stone surfaces. Mason rolled to new cover as lead whistled past his head, trying to keep track of multiple targets while avoiding the crossfire. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he had the advantage of position and the element of surprise. A rifle shot from outside the compound announced Eleanor's entry into the fight. Through the chaos, Mason saw one of the tower guards topple forward, the Whitworth's bullet having found its mark at distance. Another shot followed seconds later, and the second tower guard joined his companion in death. With the towers cleared, Eleanor could provide overwatch for the entire compound. Her next shot took out one of the men, pinning Mason down, the heavy bullet punching through his cover like it was paper. The remaining guards realized they were caught in a crossfire and began retreating toward the main house. Mason pursued them across the courtyard, his Colt speaking again and again. These men had chosen to serve evil, had taken money to guard children destined for unspeakable fates. He felt no mercy as he cut them down, only a cold satisfaction that justice was finally being served. The last guard made it to the main house and slammed the door behind him. Mason could hear him shouting inside, apparently calling for reinforcements. More men had been left behind than they'd anticipated, which meant the fight was far from over. A new voice answered the guards' calls, and Mason's blood turned to ice as he recognized it. Senator Caldwell was indeed in the compound, hadn't gone to church as expected. His arrogant procession had been a decoy designed to make potential enemies think he was vulnerable when he was actually preparing a trap. "Mr. Sinclair," Caldwell's voice carried clearly from inside the house, "I know you're out there. Your reputation precedes you, but I'm afraid you've made a serious tactical error." Mason took cover behind a stone pillar, trying to assess his situation. Unknown number of enemies inside a fortified building, children depending on him for rescue, and now the revelation that their entire plan had been anticipated. "You see," Caldwell continued, "I've been expecting someone like you for quite some time. A hero, a crusader. Someone foolish enough to think they could single-handedly stop an operation that has the protection of the highest levels of government. I've prepared for this day very carefully." As if to punctuate his words, armed men began appearing at windows throughout the house, more guards than Mason had ammunition to deal with. Caldwell had indeed been ready for them, had probably been laughing at their careful planning while preparing his own counterstrike. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Sinclair. Surrender now, and I'll make your death quick. Continue this futile resistance, and I promise you'll live long enough to watch me personally execute each of those children you came to save, starting with the youngest." The threat hit Mason like a physical blow. He'd walked into a trap, and now his actions had endangered the very children he'd come to protect. Every instinct screamed at him to charge the house, to die, fighting rather than surrender. But the rational part of his mind knew that would only ensure the children's deaths. A new gunshot rang out, but this one came from an unexpected direction. Through the house's front window, Mason saw one of Caldwell's guards topple backward, blood spreading across his shirt. Another shot followed, then another, and Mason realized that Eleanor had circled around to a new position. "Eleanor!" Caldwell's voice carried a note of surprise. "I wondered when you'd join the party, but I'm afraid your marksmanship, impressive as it is, won't be enough to save your friends." "Maybe not," Eleanor's voice called back, "but it'll be enough to kill you." A rifle bullet shattered the window frame inches from where Caldwell's voice had been coming from, sending the senator scrambling for better cover. Eleanor had the house under siege from long range, keeping Caldwell's men pinned down while Mason dealt with the immediate threats. The tactical situation was still desperate, but at least they weren't facing it alone. Mason used Eleanor's covering fire to advance toward the house, knowing that every second of delay gave Caldwell more time to organize his defenses or harm the children. As he reached the house's front porch, the door burst open, and 3 men charged out, firing as they came. Mason's Colts answered in perfect synchronization, each shot placed with the precision that had made him legendary. 2 of the men dropped immediately, but the third managed to tackle Mason, sending both of them crashing through the porch railing. They rolled in the dust, each man trying to bring his weapon to bear while preventing the other from doing the same. Mason's opponent was younger and stronger, but Mason had experience and desperation on his side. His knife found the man's ribs, sliding between bones to find his heart, and the struggle ended as suddenly as it had begun. Mason retrieved his fallen Colts and kicked in the house's front door, stepping into a grand foyer that reeked of corruption and decay. Expensive furnishings couldn't hide the evil that pervaded the place, the sense that terrible things had happened within these walls. "Senator Caldwell," Mason called out, "time to face justice." "Justice," Caldwell's laugh echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. "Mr. Sinclair, I'm justice in this territory. I decide who lives and dies, who prospers and who suffers. And you, my deluded friend, have just ensured your own very unpleasant demise." Mason moved carefully through the house, checking each room for threats while tracking Caldwell's voice. The place was a monument to wealth, built on human suffering paintings that cost more than most people made in a lifetime, furniture crafted from exotic woods, carpets woven by masters. All of it paid for with the sale of innocent children. He found Caldwell in what appeared to be a study, standing behind a massive oak desk with a derringer in his hand. The senator was exactly what Mason had expected, soft, well-dressed, radiating the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "The famous Undertaker," Caldwell said with a smile. "You know, I've followed your career with interest, such efficiency, such dedication to your craft. It's a pity we find ourselves on opposite sides." "We're not on opposite sides," Mason replied, and his Colts trained on the senator's chest. "We're on different species. You're something that feeds on children's suffering. I'm something that hunts things like you." How poetic, but ultimately meaningless. "Do you know how many children have passed through my operation?" "Hundreds, Mr. Sinclair. Hundreds of young lives that generated millions of dollars in revenue. Even if you kill me, even if you rescue the few children currently here, the network will continue. Other men will step into my place. Other children will take the place of these. Maybe, but you'll still be dead." Caldwell's smile widened. But will I? You see, Mr. Sinclair? You've made one critical error in your planning. You assumed I was the kind of man who would face you alone." The sound of a gun being cocked came from behind Mason, and he realized his mistake too late. He'd been so focused on Caldwell that he'd failed to properly clear the room, had missed the concealed door that had allowed someone to get behind him. "Drop your weapons," a familiar voice commanded. "Slowly." Mason recognized the voice without turning around. Garrett, the man who'd started this entire chain of events. The killer had survived their encounter at the mission and somehow made his way here ahead of them. "Garrett," Mason said without moving. "Should have known a cockroach like you would turn up here." "Drop the gun, Sinclair. Don't make me shoot you in the back. I'd prefer to watch your face when you die." Mason's mind raced through possibilities, looking for any angle that might give him a chance. But with Garrett behind him and Caldwell in front, his options were limited to compliance or death. "That's better," Caldwell said, as Mason slowly placed his Colts on the floor. "Now then, shall we discuss the terms of your surrender?" "The only terms I'm interested in are the ones that get those children to safety." "Admirable sentiment, but unrealistic. Those children are valuable assets, Mr. Sinclair. They represent a significant investment that my organization cannot simply write off." The casual way Caldwell discussed human beings as investments made Mason's vision blur with rage. But before he could respond, the sound of breaking glass came from elsewhere in the house, followed immediately by gunshots. "What the hell?" Garrett started to say, then grunted and stumbled forward. Mason spun around to see a knife protruding from between the man's shoulder blades and Maria Santos standing in the doorway with blood on her hands. "The children are safe," she announced calmly. "And Garrett won't be bothering anyone anymore." Mason dove for his weapons as Caldwell brought up his derringer. The senator's shot went wide, chipping plaster from the wall where Mason's head had been a moment before. Mason's return fire didn't miss both. Colt spoke simultaneously, their bullets finding Caldwell's chest and ending his reign of terror forever. The senator collapsed behind his desk, his expensive clothes already soaked with blood. But even dying, he managed to smile. "You think you've won," he gasped. "The network, bigger than you know. Other men, other operations. You've barely scratched the surface." "Maybe," Mason said, standing over him, "but we've scratched deep enough to reach you." Caldwell's eyes glazed over, and Senator Thomas Caldwell, respected politician and child trafficker, died on the floor of his own study. Maria was already moving, checking Garrett's body for weapons and searching for additional threats. "Eleanor's securing the perimeter," she reported, "but we need to move quickly. That gunfire will bring every lawman and bounty hunter within 50 miles. They returned to the prison building to find Eleanor helping the children prepare for travel. She'd found horses in the stable and was working out how to transport children who were too weak to ride alone. "How are they?" Mason asked. "Physically, they'll recover with proper care and nutrition. Mentally," Eleanor shook her head. "That's going to take longer, but they're alive and they're free. That's what matters right now." The evacuation took 2 hours of careful work. Some of the children could ride, others had to be carried, and all of them needed constant reassurance that they were truly being rescued. Maria's medical training proved invaluable, as several children required immediate attention for injuries and malnutrition. As they prepared to leave the Circle C ranch forever, Mason took one last look at the compound that had been the center of so much evil. Smoke was beginning to rise from the main house where Eleanor had set fires to destroy Caldwell's records and prevent anyone from continuing his work. "It's over," Eleanor said, joining him at the compound's gates. "This part is." But Caldwell was right about one thing: this network is bigger than just his operation. There are other children still trapped, other men who need to face justice. Then we'll find them. All of them, no matter how long it takes. The ride to Father Miguel's mission took 3 days, traveling slowly to accommodate the children's weakened condition. Along the way, some of them began to remember their real names, their families, their lives before the nightmare. Lucy Morrison told them about her parents' farm in Kansas. A boy named Thomas spoke of his sister who might still be alive somewhere. Each recovered memory was a small victory against the men who'd tried to erase their identities. Father Miguel welcomed them without question, immediately setting his staff to work providing medical care and emotional support for the rescued children. The mission had dealt with trauma survivors before, and they knew how to help children heal from experiences no one should ever endure. "You've done something remarkable," the priest told Mason as they watched the children being settled into clean beds with warm food and gentle care. "But you know this is only the beginning." "I know. We recovered some of Caldwell's records before burning the house. Names, locations, connections to other operations. It's going to take time to follow up on all of it. And you're prepared for that. For years of hunting these men, knowing that new ones will always take their place." Mason looked across the mission's courtyard at Eleanor, who was helping Maria treat a young girl's infected wounds. The governess who'd whispered, "I'm filthy inside and out," was gone, replaced by a woman who radiated strength and purpose. She'd found her calling in the fight against evil, just as he'd found his redemption in protecting the innocent. "We're prepared," he said simply. 3 months later, Mason Sinclair stood in the witness stand of a federal courthouse in Denver, describing what he'd seen at the Circle C ranch. The trial of corrupt federal Marshal Thompson had drawn national attention, partly because of the scope of the crimes involved, but mostly because it proved that even the most powerful criminals could be brought to justice. Eleanor and Maria sat in the gallery, both now working with a network of reformers dedicated to exposing and stopping human trafficking throughout the West. The evidence they'd recovered from Caldwell's operation had led to dozens of arrests and the rescue of nearly 200 children from similar operations. But as Mason testified about the horrors he'd witnessed, he knew their work was far from finished. Thompson's trial was just one victory in a war that would likely last the rest of their lives. Somewhere in hidden warehouses and fortified ranches, children were still being held against their will, still waiting for someone brave enough to risk everything for their freedom. After the trial, the three of them stood on the courthouse steps, watching crowds of reporters and curious citizens disperse. The story of their fight against Caldwell's network had captured the public imagination, inspiring copycat investigations in other territories and states. "So what now?" Maria asked. Thompson's going to prison, Morrison's bank has been shut down, and Congress is talking about new laws to prevent this kind of corruption. Now we find the next Caldwell, Eleanor replied, and the one after that and the one after that. Mason nodded agreement, his hand unconsciously moving to the badge pinned to his vest, a federal marshal's star legally appointed to investigate crimes across territorial boundaries. The government that had once protected men like Caldwell was now hunting them, using the same skills and determination that had once served evil to serve justice instead. As they walked away from the courthouse, Mason thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made to her grave to find another way. She'd been right as she'd been right about so many things. There was always another way, always a choice between violence and justice, between vengeance and protection. He'd found his path at last, not in abandoning his skills, but in using them for something bigger than himself. Eleanor and Maria had found theirs as well, choosing to spend their lives ensuring that no child would suffer, as they had seen children suffer. Behind them, the courthouse clock struck noon, its chimes echoing across Denver's growing skyline. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle announced the arrival of travelers from distant places carrying news and stories from across the rapidly changing West. And somewhere else, in places yet to be discovered, children were waiting for rescue that would come not from governments or laws, but from ordinary people who'd decided that some fights were worth whatever they might cost. The war against evil was far from over. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Mason Sinclair knew exactly where he belonged in that fight, and exactly why it mattered that he never give up. The story that had begun with gunshots in the desert would continue in courtrooms and rescue missions, in congressional hearings and midnight raids, until every last child was free and every last trafficker faced the justice they'd tried so hard to avoid. It was not the ending Mason had expected when he first heard those gunshots echoing across the New Mexico desert, but it was the ending Sarah would have wanted, the one that proved her faith in his ability to find another way had been justified all along. Justice, it turned out, was not just about the punishment of evil. Sometimes it was about the redemption of those who chose to fight it, no matter the cost to themselves. And sometimes that was enough to change the world.